Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. This is the podcast that delves into the intricate world of global politics, the past and present, while also exploring potential possibilities for what tomorrow could bring. I'm your host, Dylan, and this has been recorded on the 7th of June, 2024. In each episode here of the Geopolitics Explained podcast, we'll break down complex issues into small, understandable chunks through in-depth scenario analysis. So come and join us as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of international relations, uncovering the stories behind the headlines and predicting trends that could shape the future of our world. This is being recorded on the 27th of August, 2024. I initially recorded this episode on the 21st of August, but I attempted to record it on my phone and the quality wasn't good. So if I couldn't make it through editing the episode, I imagine people listening also wouldn't be able to make it through the episode. So we're re-recording today on the 27th of August. And I've decided to cover an area that I've not discussed too often, specifically a country that I've not discussed too often, that being Bangladesh. Now, it's been quite a year, with elections in January 2024, seeing Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League win a fourth consecutive term. However, at the end of July, protests started to erupt. These protests spiralled and have led to Sheikh Hasina resigning and fleeing the country. So I'm going to break down the history of elections in Bangladesh, how these protests formed, and how they eventually led to the situation that saw Hasina flee the country. I'll finally then delve into where Bangladesh sees itself currently politically and potential directions that it could be heading in the future. Now, as I stated in the introduction, this was the fourth consecutive term that Sheikh Hasina had been elected for in the January 2024 election. Her party, the Awami League, gained 224 of the 300 seats, but the election only saw a 41.8% turnout. This had also been changed from the initial electoral commission that revealed a turnout of around 28%. This has led to a level of uncertainty regarding what the actual turnout was and whether it was anywhere remotely close to the 41.8% that was stated. In 2018, which makes this turnout of 41.8% even more shocking, there was a turnout of 80.2%. This meant that from the 2018 election, turnout fell by 39.4%. Quite a difference. In this election, as has occurred in many previous elections in Bangladesh, we saw massive arrests of members of the opposition party, who are called the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. Based on this, the BNP boycotted this election in January 2024, and this isn't the first time they've done this. They also boycotted the elections in 2018 and 2014. Specifically, in the 2018 election, the leader of the BNP, called Khaleda Zia, was put under house arrest. She was then charged with corruption and initially sentenced to 5 years in prison. This was later raised to 10 years in prison. She is now out of prison, which is something that I will come back to later on in this episode. Now, diving into the history of the elections in Bangladesh before 2014 also brings up some interesting trends. 2008 marked Sheikh Hasina's first term in the 4 consecutive terms that we've been referring to. But prior to that, in 2001, we saw the current opposition, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, win the election. They won 193 seats in this election versus 62 that was won by Hasina's Awami League. This meant that Khaleda Zia was the Prime Minister of Bangladesh during this time. Before the 2001 election, we saw an election in February of 1996, which saw a lot of similar trends occurring to what have occurred in this 2024 election, but they occurred on the other side of the political spectrum in Bangladesh. First of all, the election in February 1996 was won by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and it saw a very low turnout of 21%. The February 1996 election was also boycotted by most of the opposition parties. In this situation, in February 1996, the government lasted 12 days before a caretaker government was installed, and another election was set for June of 1996. It was this election that first saw Sheikh Hasina rise to power in Bangladesh. This was her first term, so she's had 5 terms overall. The 4 most recent have been consecutive terms, and these lead up to the point that we're going to start discussing from today. Another interesting aspect of these elections is why the Bangladesh Nationalist Party has chosen to boycott so many of these elections. Back in 2006, a caretaker government assumed power in Bangladesh, and this caretaker government was supported by the military. This saw Sheikh Hasina lose power for this period. However, she was elected again in 2008. After this election is when many commentators started describing Bangladesh as a falling democracy, and there were many commentators noting that Bangladesh was trending towards a more authoritarian stance. This was seemingly confirmed in 2011 when Sheikh Hasina removed the requirement for a temporary independent government to be formed before elections. This strategy was supposed to ensure rule of power was transferred peacefully, and it was a part of a democratic system that enforced that elections were free and fair. Hasina scrapped this, and any elections since then hasn't seen a temporary independent government formed. Hasina hence has ruled for this entire period, and as we know, also won the election in January 2024. This policy decision is likely a massive influence on how we got to where we are today. When focusing specifically on this year, that being the year of 2024, these elections in January only mark the start of the story. The second chapter in this story started to unfold with the protests that have been occurring in Bangladesh. Now, before I specifically dive into the details of these protests that started in July, I'm going to flash back a few years to reasons why anger has been building amongst Bangladeshi citizens and why we've been seeing more and more of these protests occurring. Back in mid-2022, inflation was starting to rise in Bangladesh. Over the year, it averaged 7.7%, and the average in 2023 rose to 9.5%. Also occurring at the same time, IMF loan conditions had kicked in. Bangladesh was experiencing a fall in its foreign exchange reserves, while its foreign debt had doubled. Also, many consumers within Bangladesh had seen rising energy costs. One aspect of this that I've discussed before, these rising energy costs were especially felt in poorer countries, specifically Bangladesh and Pakistan, as they were outbid on liquefied natural gas by Western countries who were trying to fill their storages for the winter. If we can remember, this occurred due to the Nord Stream sabotage that occurred in 2022 and the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, which saw the energy fracturing between Russia and the West. To further stoke anger in Bangladesh, it's since been revealed that during Hasina's previous government, she had to fire a house assistant who had somehow managed to steal $34 million in government funding. There were also protests that were primarily led by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party in October of 2023. The main reason for these protests was, as I stated earlier, Hasina removing the requirement for a temporary independent government to be formed prior to elections. This showed how deep this policy issue is in Bangladeshi politics, based on the fact that she removed this policy in 2011, and 12 years later, this is still being protested against. The numbers differ when regarding this protest in October 2023, but many thousands were arrested and many were killed and injured. Back specifically to the protests that started occurring in July of 2024, and over time, the students were joined by many other protesters, and the main reason for the protests occurring drastically shifted. Initially, these were about quotas in the labour market, where a third of jobs were saved for any Bangladeshi relations who took part in the War of Independence against Pakistan. This has contributed to a high unemployment rate among the youth, and hence they flocked to the streets to protest these quotas. These protests then pivoted when many other protesters decided to join in. The demands of the protesters were justice, stability, and an end to corruption. Now, these protests continued on for weeks. The internet was cut off by the Hasina government and a curfew was imposed. This is when protests started growing more violent and many protesters were killed. But these protests carried on occurring. This eventually led us to the start of August, where these protesters found themselves in a position to attack Sheikh Hasina's residence. When they breached her residence, it was revealed that Hasina had resigned and fled the country, where she flew to India. Now, with this occurring, this has left Bangladeshi politics in turmoil once again. The next big question is, where do we head from here? Before I dive into where Bangladesh could be heading in the future, I'm going to explore a few deeper issues and trends that have been occurring, specifically regarding the status of Hasina and seemingly what is looking like the end of her current period of rule. In analysing these protests, I think it's useful to assess the history of Bangladeshi politics, specifically the intense rivalry between the Awami League and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. Now, on both sides of this political rivalry, there have been discussions in the past as to whether these parties could actually be described as dynasties. Sheikh Hasina is the daughter of a former Bangladesh president who was killed in a 1975 coup, along with the rest of her family. Hasina was out of the country at the time, hence why she survived the attack. And Hasina rose to become the head of the Awami League and has sat in that position since 1981. Now, when we flash to the other side of the political spectrum in Bangladesh, and we look at Khaleda Zia, who is the leader of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, she's the widow of another former president of Bangladesh, who founded the Bangladesh Nationalist Party in the late 1970s. So both have strong political ties to their parties, and both have a deep history within those parties and a strong rivalry against each other. The most important thing to take away from this is that both have been accused of being corrupt in the past, and both have used nefarious means to win elections that have seen incredibly low turnouts. If one thing is clear, it's that politics in Bangladesh doesn't particularly represent a large majority of the people, regardless of which party is in rule. So Bangladesh has seen itself in turmoil for at least a couple of years now regarding the protests that have been occurring in the country. In an attempt to tackle this issue, the Hasina government actually scaled back most of the quotas, but this is where the protests continued and then escalated. In considering this removal of Hasina, with her resignation and her fleeing to India, some commentators have referred to this as an attempted coup. One thing I'll say on the removal of Hasina from power is that no coup occurs without the military. That's clear when we look to Venezuela currently, who, since their election, protesters have flocked to the street, with many accusing Maduro, who won the election, of rigging the election to remain in power. Maduro did exclude many opposition members from running, but he still yet hasn't been ousted from power. This is because the protesters in Venezuela are not supported by the military. Over 2,000 arrests had been made since the last time I looked at the news, and that was a few weeks ago. So, for this coup, if it is a coup to occur in Bangladesh, Hasina has to have lost the army from backing her. Now, the army did refuse to support a government-ordered lockdown prior to Hasina stepping down, so this could have been the point at which the army stopped supporting Hasina, which then saw her resign and flee the country. Since Hasina has been ousted from the country, the US hasn't condemned the situation of Hasina being removed from power. This is likely because it's favourable to American interests. If the Americans do condemn changes in government power, historically, we usually see foreign assistance being cut off. This isn't something that we've seen in Bangladesh, and it could imply how the US feels about the entire situation. We've also seen the leader of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, Khaleda Zia, released from prison on the 5th of August. This could play heavily into where Bangladeshi politics is heading from here. Since Hasina has fled, an interim government has been appointed in Bangladesh. They've stated that their main aims are to stop the violence and rebuild political trust. They are currently struggling to calm the violence because supporters of the Awami League and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party are still protesting and clashing outside of Hasina's residence as recently as a few weeks ago. This interim government is being led by Muhammad Yunus, who is Bangladesh's only Nobel Peace Prize winner from 2006 for his work in microfinance. He has worked to raise many Bangladeshi citizens who were less fortunate out of poverty. The announcement of this interim government also came with an announcement that further elections would occur in Bangladesh in 2024. For me, the first question that arises is, will Khaleda Zia be eyeing a campaign for this election that will run in November 2024? Also, we don't know about the status of Sheikh Hasina, who is still leader of the Awami League, but isn't within Bangladesh itself. Does Hasina being outside of Bangladesh potentially pave the way for the Bangladesh Nationalist Party to return to power? We could also see this interim government playing a key role in the election, Will they potentially throw their name in the hat as a potential government to run Bangladesh? There is also the fact that the rivalry between Sheikh Hasina and Khaleda Zia still exists, and that both have used underhanded tactics in the past and could so again. If the Bangladesh Nationalist Party does have a undisturbed road to power in November 2024, will we see them ban any other potential opposition parties and candidates? I think this remains to be seen. This has been another episode of the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? And if you want more content like this, we write over on Substack. You can find the link for this in the description. Once again, I've been Dylan. Until next time, signing off.